Hello everyone, welcome back. In the previous video, we had created the database interface completed with functions to interact with MongoDB, implemented routes and handlers for each CRUD operations, and finally we used Postman to perform a live test on our REST endpoint API to create, update, delete and search our to-do items. Today, we are going to do similar test to test each of the handlers by writing test files. Finally, we are going to mock the database call in our unit test so that we can verify our code without depending on the database. First, let's create a new collection called to-do-test so that we can run our test against it. In the init-mongo.js, add a new line db.create collection to-do-test. Let's begin with testing insert to-do handlers. Create a new file called insert_to-do_test.go. Package name handlers_test. Similar to the main function, we need to initialize the test database. Let's start by declare a client variable of type database to-do interface. Create an init function and copy the code from the main function. Instead of reading from config file, we can define our Mongo test database as follows. The server is MongoDB://localhost with port 27017. Database name is the same, mgo. And collection name is to-do-test. Update the database connection called to use our new config and change the collection name to conf.collection. Now, create a test function test insert to-do, which accepts a testing pointer. Create a test table of type map string struct. It consists of payload as a string, expected code as integer, and expected value as string. And we can add our test cases as below. The first test case should return 200, and the payload is a JSON string with user ID as 1, title as learning Golang, and completed status as false. Expected code is 200, and expected value is the title, so it is learning Golang. The second test case should return 400, because we send an invalid JSON string as payload. Then, we can loop through the test table and test each case. Create a for loop with name and test from range tests. Run a test with t.run function which accepts test name, and a callback function. Create a new post to do request which accepts the payload. Create an HTTP test new recorder. Then, create a handler function which calls handlers.insert to do with the test database client. Call serve HTTP to execute the request. Now let's verify the result. If the test succeeded, we expect the return code to be 200. Convert response body into to-do object. Check to-do title equal to the expected value. If the test fails, then the return code will be 400. And assert to-do ID to be not nil. Finally, we can add a cleanup step by deleting the record from the test database. To run our test, we need our test database. So, go to terminal, start the Docker process with command, open --background-a Docker. Wait a couple of minutes for Docker to start. Then, enter docker-compose up-build to start our test database. Once the Mongo database is up, then we can run our test. Open a new terminal and enter go test-v. We can see that it runs test insert to do, and both cases pass. Let's print out the result and see the return value. After h.serve HTTP call, add fmt.println rec.body.string. Then we can run our test. We can see that it actually created to-do record with Mongo ID for the first test case, and it returned an error message for the second one. Next, create a new file update to do underscore test.go. Package name handlers underscore test. Since it is in the same package handlers test, we don't need to reinitialize the test database. We can use the same database client from insert to do. However, in order to test an update, we need an existing record. So, let's create a helper function add new to-do which insert a to-do item and return a string ID. To-do body is user ID 1, title is learning Golang, and completed is false. Next, call client.insert to-do body, which return to-do. And return to-do ID as hex string. Create a test update to-do function, accepts testing pointer t. First call our helper function add new to-do to get the ID. Then, create the test table struct which consists of string ID, string payload, integer expected code, and modified count as integer 64. The first test case, to test the successfully update, should return 200 and modified count 1. We pass in the ID, the payload with completed change to true. Expected count 200, and modified count is 1. The second test case, to test the no update, should return 200, but modified count is 0. We pass in the ID, the payload with title equal learning Golang. Expected code 200, and modified count 0. Finally, to test an error case, it should return 400. We pass in the ID, payload with invalid JSON string. And expected code 400. Now let's loop through the test cases and call t.run to execute our test. First, create a new patch request with the URL /todo plus test.id, which accepts the test payload. Next, create a response recorder with HTTP test new recorder function. We need to create a new router using mux.newRouter. Since we need to pull the ID parameter from the URL inside the update to do handlers. Then, call router handle funquith to do ID and handlers update to do with the test client. Finally, execute the request with router serve HTTP. In success case, we expect response code to be 200 and the response body to contain modified count to be 1 or 0. Create a to-do variable of type to-do update model to hold the response body result. Then assert equal the modified count from response against the expected modified count. In failure case, we expected the response code to be 400. Finally, we have to clean up the test record, just called client.delete with the record ID. Now go to the terminal, enter go test-v. Oops, there is something wrong. OID conversion fails. Let's fix that by first convert it to object ID, then convert it to string using hex function. Now run the test again, and it pass. To run an individual test, we can specify the test function name with -run cap test update to do $. We can see that all the update test pass. Next, let's test delete to do handlers. Create a new file delete to do underscore test.go. The delete to do test is similar with update to do test, so we can just copy the code from update to do test. Since it is in the same handler's test package, we can reuse the add new to do function from update to do test, so we don't need to declare it here. Change the function name to test delete to do. In the test table, remove the payload and change modified count to deleted count. Update the test case as follows. The first test case should return 200 and deleted count 1. The second test case should return 200 and deleted count 0. The third test case should return 400 because the ID is not found. The fourth test case should return 404 because the ID is empty. In the t.run, change the new request call from patch to delete. We don't need the payload, so change it to nil. Change update to do handlers to delete to do handlers. Replace to do update models with to do delete models. Replace modified count with deleted count. Now go to terminal and run our test. We can see that all the tests pass. The next test is get to do handler. Create a new file get_to_do_test.go. Copy everything from delete to do test.go. Update the function name to test get to do. Remove deleted count and add expected if type string. Update the test cases as follows. The first case should return 200, an expected value learning Golang. The second case should return 400 with invalid ID, and the third case should return 404 with empty ID. In the r.run function, replace the delete method with get. Change the delete to do handlers to get to do handlers, and replace to do delete models with to do models. Now go to terminal and run our test. We can see that all the tests pass. Finally, create the last test file, search to do_test.go. Copy the code from get to do test file. Update the function name to test search to do. Change the test table elements to string payload, integer expected code, and expected of type string. Update the test case as follows. Name the first test case as should return 200, found. The second test case should return 200, but not found. The payload is title equal learning Docker, expected code 200, and expected value is empty. The third case should return 400. The payload is invalid JSON query, and expected code 400. In the t.run, update the URL to /to_do?q equal plus test payload. Change handler's name to search to do. Update to do models to array of to do model. Change the routes to /to do. And put the assert value inside the loop as the result is an array. Now go to terminal and run the test. We see that all the test cases pass. Now run all the tests, and all still pass. Finally, let's look at how to mock the database call using testify mock package. Create a new file to do_mock.go in database package. Declare package name database. Create a mock-to-do client struct, which contains mock.mock. Implement all interface functions as in to-do interface. The first one, create function insert of mock-to-do client, accepts to-do model, and return to-do model or an error. Inside the function body, create a new variables argument, which call m.called an accepted to-do model. Return type our to-do model, and an error. Next, create update function of mock-to-do client, accept string ID and update of type interface, and return to-do update model or an error. Set the variables argument to call m.called an accepted string ID and update. Return type our to-do update model, and an error. Then, create delete function of mock-to-do client, accepts just the string ID, and return to-do delete model or an error. Set the variables argument to call m.called an accepted string ID. return type our to-do delete model, and an error. Last, but not least, the get function accepts string ID and return to-do model or an error. Set the variable's argument to call m.called an accepted string ID. Return type our to-do model and an error. Finally, the search function, which accepts the query filter of type interface and return array of to-do model or an error. Set the variable's argument to call m.called an accepted interface filter. Return type our array of to-do model and an error. Since these mock functions do not interact with the actual database, we can't actually test the functionalities of search, insert, update, delete, or get. Rather, we only test whether these functions will be called correctly or not. Now let's start with get-to-do test handlers. First, create a client variable to be an instance of mock-to-do client. Then, create a new ID from primitive new object ID function and convert it to hex string. Create test table of type map string struct, which contains string ID and integer expected code. The first test case should return 200 with valid ID. The second test case should return 404 with missing ID. Now in the t.run function, add client.on with function name get in parameters test.id and return an empty to-do model and nil. This is to mock the get function. We don't actually care about the result. We only check if this function is being called or not. In the case of success, expect head code equal 200, then the get function should be called, and we check that by using assert expectations method from testify mock package. Otherwise, using assert not called method to verify that the get function is not called. We don't need to clean up any record as we don't create anything. Now to run the test, go to terminal and enter go test-v./run cap test get to do $. We see that the test pass. To verify whether the mock function is being called correctly, go to todomock.go in the database package. Inside the get function, let's print call get mock function. Now run the test again. We can see the message being printed out, and it only printed out once. This confirmed that our mock function is called correctly. Next, open delete to do test.go. Just copy everything from get to do test.go. Change the function name to test delete to do. Change the mock function name to delete, and it should return to do delete model. Change the request method to delete. Update the handler's name to delete to do. Finally, change the assert not called method name to delete. To run the test, go to the top of test delete to do function name and click on debug test. If prompted, enter the password. We see that the test pass. This is another way of running the test using the plugin in VS Code. Move the mouse cursor on top of the test get to do function name. It shows two commands, run test and debug test. The run test command runs the test similar to the command in the terminal, but it only runs one test, while the terminal command runs all the tests. Actually, it shows the command it uses. And we can just copy the command and run it in the terminal to get the same result. The debug test command, on the other hand, allows us to walk through the code, set breakpoint and see the test in action. Let's set breakpoint inside the delete function in todomock.go database package. Set another breakpoint at h.serve http. Click on debug test. The test will run up to the first breakpoint. Then, we can click on continue or press F5 to proceed to the next breakpoint if any. Click on step over or F10 to proceed to the next line. Or click on step into or F11 to go into individual function. Since we already set the breakpoints, we can just click continue to go to the next breakpoint. As we can see, it stopped at the delete function in the mock to-do client, instead of calling the delete function from to-do client. Click Continue again to finish the test, and it passed. Next, copy everything from test delete to do and paste in search to do test.go. Remove the ID, since we don't need it. In the test table body, change ID to payload string. In the first test case, replace the ID with the payload. Title is Learning Golang. In the second test case, the name should return 400. Replace ID with payload and valid JSON string, and expected code is 400. Change the mock function name to search. Update the parameters to mock anything. And return array of to-do model and nil. Change request method to get. Update the URL to accept payload as query string. Change handler's name to search to do. Now run the test, and it should pass. For test update to do, copy everything from test delete to do, paste an update to do test.go. Change the function name to test update to do. Add string payload into the first test case. Update the mock function name to update, and it expects two parameters, ID string and update interface, so just add mock.anything as the second parameters. It should return to do update model and nil. Change the request method to patch, and pass in the payload into the request. Change the handler's name to update to do. Finally, update the assert not called method to update. Run the test, it should pass. Finally, open insert to do test.go. Remove the init function and the variable client as we no longer need them. Declare a new client variable and instance of mock to do client inside the test insert to do function. Remove expected string from the test table and each test case. In t.run function, add the mock function client.onInsert with parameter mock.anything and return to do model and nil. Copy the assert check from test update to do. And change the assert not called method name to insert. Now run the test, and it should pass. Let's run all tests. Go to terminal and enter. Go test-v /. All tests still pass. That is the end of our series. Please leave comments below if you have any questions or suggestions of any topic for me to cover. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.